Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sorry, that's what happens when our 30-minute meetings apart get started late on the first one. We will convene. I'd like to welcome back the Federal Communications Commission Chairman Ajit Pai and Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. I got it right this year. It's been a year since we've had a chance to talk to you both. A lot has happened this time. FCC has committed to an extensive amount of work for itself in the coming months. The agency is planning to hold numerous auctions for spectrum and broadband, as well as implementing congressional directives on robocalls and pirate radio enforcement. The FCC has asked for a $4 million increase this year, just enough to absorb its inflationary costs. We're interested in learning more about whether the FCC has sufficient resources to complete its ambitious agenda, and if it's realistic to take on all of this work. I also want to discuss the importance of prioritizing consumer protection. We continue to see that when it comes to policies that assist wireless and broadband companies, the FCC can't seem to move fast enough. In the process, it undermines competitions and threatens to waste limited federal dollars. But taking action to protect consumers seems like an afterthought. For example, Chairman Pai undid net neutrality in just 8 months, which involved processing more than 20 million comments. A significant portion of these were fraudulent, something the FCC did nothing to address. It took only 16 months to approve the merger of Sprint and T-Mobile, one of the more complex and significant changes in the market in recent years. I was glad to see the FCC move to a public auction for C-band spectrum, but I'm concerned that the Commission was seriously considering a private auction put on by satellite companies instead of an FCC. We have made significant investments in the auctions program and to handle competitive processes like this. I'm also concerned that the Commission is still planning to give away $10 billion to these private foreign companies. That's valuable funding that could support other important priorities like enhancing our 911 system or providing broadband to underserved areas. It is also no secret that the FCC's maps need major improvements. I'm disappointed that rather than taking the time to fix these problems, they plan to dole out $16 billion to broadband subsidies by the end of the year. This would leave just $4 billion for the areas that are partially served or incorrectly marked as served. Turning to the FCC's enforcement responsibilities, while I'm pleased the FCC has announced $200 million in penalties against wireless companies that shared consumer location data, an egregious violation of privacy, the investigation took nearly 2 years. Perhaps if the FCC would have prioritized their enforcement duty, this wouldn't have been such a drawn-out undertaking. I'm also pleased the FCC is finally taking robust action against robocalls, including mandating call authentication technology, but I'd like to point out that the FCC only did this after Congress stepped in and directed them to. Perhaps what is most concerning is the lack of action over broadband complaints. When it eliminated net neutrality, the FCC said it would share information with the Federal Trade Commission to ensure consumers are still protected, but we still learn that the FCC has not made a single affirmative referral to the FTC about broadband service since August 2018, when the net neutrality repeal took effect. This is deeply concerning and not what the American people expect from their government. I look forward to discussing these issues in more detail. Before turning to the witnesses, I would like to recognize Mr. Amadei for his opening remarks, and we are all keeping our ranking member, Mr. Graves, and his family in our prayers and thoughts, and wish the best for his son's recovery. Mr. Amadei.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well done. Catches me up for my being late. I appreciate your consideration. Thank you, and I would now like to recognize Chairman Pai for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Amadei, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to present the FCC's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Before I discuss our budget, I wanted to convey my sentiments which concord with the chairman's. My thoughts and prayers are with Ranking Member Graves and his family, and I certainly pray that his son will have a full and speedy recovery. I also wanted to let you know that the Commission has a team in place to address the coronavirus situation. Importantly, we have taken affirmative steps to protect our employees and safeguard their health, and we've also been consulting with industry on their preparedness. Now, turning back to the budget, the FCC requests $343,070,000 for FCC salaries and expenses and an auction spending cap of $134,495,000. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the subcommittee for supporting the Commission's work. The funding that you have provided has allowed us to pursue policies that are delivering real results for the American people. The digital divide is closing, with new fiber deployment setting records in both 2018 and 2019. Broadband service is improving, with average speeds skyrocketing, and the internet remains free and open. The United States is leading the world in 5G, with the FCC delivering low, mid, and high band spectrum. And communications technology is making the American people safer and more secure, with improved and more targeted wireless emergency alerts now available to the vast majority of our citizens. But of course, our work is not done. And looking to the future, our budget request would modestly increase general spending by $4 million and lift the spectrum auctions cap by $2 million. These additional funds would support our continuing commitment to modernizing information technology, as well as cover legally mandated pay increases for the FCC's excellent staff. Now, this morning, I'd like to briefly discuss how we intend to use the funds that we are seeking to advance 3 priorities. First, closing the digital divide. I am proud that during the first 2 years of this administration, we have reduced the number of Americans without access to 25.3 megabit per second fixed broadband by 30%, and the number of Americans without access to 250 20 megabit per second fixed broadband by about 3/4. Going forward, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund represents the Commission's boldest step yet in bridging the digital divide. This new program will provide more than $20 billion over the next decade to support up to gigabit service to up to 6 million rural homes and businesses through a competitive reverse auction. We'll target support to areas that lack access to fixed 25/3 megabit per second broadband through a 2-phase approach. The first phase will address areas of the country that everybody agrees are unserved, including more than 100,000 locations each in states like Illinois, California, Arizona, Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The second phase will cover areas in which the first phase does not yield winning bidders and any areas that are partially served. For instance, if some households in a census block are covered, but the remainder are not. Second, the FCC's budget request is essential to advancing our strategy to facilitate America's superiority in 5G technology. Our 5G FAST plan has 3 main parts, but this morning I'd like to focus on the first, which is making more spectrum available. During the last 16 months, we've completed 3 5G spectrum auctions. All told, these auctions made available almost 5 gigahertz of high-band spectrum for commercial use, and gross proceeds totaled over $10 billion. We've also been hard at work at mid-band spectrum. On June 25th, we'll begin our 3.5 gigahertz auction, in which we'll make available 70 megahertz of spectrum. And I'm pleased to report that we're on track to begin a C-band auction on December 8th. In that auction, we will make a lot of C-band spectrum, 280 megahertz, available for 5G, and generate a lot of revenue for the federal government. We'll also use our funding to continue protecting the national security of the United States. Last year, the FCC unanimously adopted rules to prohibit Universal Service Fund recipients from purchasing equipment from vendors deemed national security risks, and we initially designated Huawei and ZTE as such vendors. And last month, the FCC launched an information collection from carriers on the use of Huawei or ZTE equipment and services that may be in their networks. And we're now considering whether to mandate that USF-funded carriers remove equipment supplied by companies deemed national security threats from their networks and to reimburse carriers for the costs of doing so. I hope that we'll be able to move forward on this proposal in the near future. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Amodei, members of the subcommittee, thank you once again for holding this hearing. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Good morning, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, who is in our thoughts, Congressman Amodei, and the rest of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I believe the future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live in this country, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. That's why it's never been as important to have a strong FCC working in the public interest. But right now, I believe the FCC is falling behind when it comes to its core duties under the Communications Act. And on top of this, the FCC has been tasked by Congress with significant new work in the Mobile Now Act, Ray Baum's Act, Traced Act, and Pirate Act. According to the request before you, all of this work will be accomplished with a budget of just over $343 million, an amount that, when inflation is taken into account, leaves the FCC with less and not more. This work must be done with one of the lowest staffing levels in the agency's history. In fact, we have nearly 1,000 fewer employees than the FCC had at its peak in 1995, before the internet era truly began. Since then, our population nationally has grown by 24%, our national GDP has nearly doubled, and the FCC's jurisdiction now covers 1/6 of the United States economy. But according to the most recent Federal Viewpoint survey, more than 1/3 of the agency's staff believe they do not have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively. So let me highlight why this matters, and I will start with robocalls. At the beginning of this administration, there were roughly 2 billion robocalls a month. Now there are routinely as many as 6 billion robocalls a month. But the FCC has just 12 staff fully dedicated to robocall enforcement, and it takes an average of 649 days to complete a robocall enforcement item. That's insane. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. In report language last year, you asked the FCC to consider a new organizational unit to tackle robocall enforcement. We still don't have one, and we need it. Second, it matters for our universal service program, which is how we ensure that Americans have access to broadband. It's no secret that the FCC's broadband maps are totally inaccurate. They've been panned by cabinet secretaries, members of Congress, and consumers. Still, the agency is moving ahead with a plan to spend the vast majority of our broadband funding for the next 10 years, that's $16 billion, without first doing anything to improve our maps. This is a mistake. We first need to know where broadband is and is not. We should have maps before money and data before deployment. And on this point, we testified before the Senate yesterday, and we agreed we could fix our maps in just a few months. So why not get to work and do it right now? Third, it matters for our ability to recover from disasters. Communications are essential when the unthinkable occurs, but on too many recent occasions when disaster has struck, communications have failed. It's been over 2 years since the GAO released a report recommending action on network resiliency, and I think we have too little to show for it. We also have a lot more work to do to secure our 5G networks and supply chains, and we're going to have to move faster to do it. Fourth, it matters because competition benefits consumers. Over my objection, the agency reduced competition in the wireless market by giving its blessing to the largest wireless merger in our nation's history. On top of that, it rolled back our net neutrality rules despite the clear lack of broadband competition in this country. Now the FCC has been asked by a court to justify its net neutrality decision. So last month, the agency released a notice seeking public comment on these matters. But the FCC did everything in its power to make sure no one noticed. The agency buried the document on the website. Its text was all legalese. It made sure the words net neutrality were nowhere to be found. This isn't the way we should operate, and whatever your stance is on net neutrality, this process should concern you. We can do better than this. Finally, it is absolutely time for the FCC to talk about coronavirus disruption and how technology can help. Nationwide, we are going to explore the expansion of telework, telehealth, and teleeducation. And in the process, we are going to expose some truly hard facts about the scope of the digital divide. The FCC should be convening broadband providers right now to prepare. It should be identifying how it can use its universal service powers to support connected care for quarantined patients and Wi-Fi hotspots for loan for students whose schools have shut and classes have migrated online. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves and Amodei, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. So we're going to need a little self-discipline here. You can see there's no clock, so what I'll do is give you a friendly tap when there's a minute left, and then a loud banging when you've gone past your time. But because I was late, I'm going to start with Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much. Welcome to both of you again. Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and the broadband mapping and the politicization of FCC. A major priority of mine is bridging the urban and the rural divide when it comes to broadband and access to leveraging opportunities for the internet, which is why initiatives such as the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund are very intriguing. But for such initiatives to work, we've got to have accurate maps so we can assess which areas, which buildings and homes are lacking adequate access to broadband. The rollout of the fund is extremely troubling. For starters, it's being rolled out using old maps. This is even though some states, such as my state of Georgia, already have updated maps. Further, Mr. Chairman, you've been a critic of executive interference with the FCC, yet you announced this funding alongside the President of the White House, and the program is set to start 13 days before the 2020 election. This is troubling. The FCC should be focused on serving the American people and not politicizing or winning elections. Commissioner Rosenworcel, you've noted that this appears to be more publicity stunt than policy. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. Look, you can't manage problems that you don't measure. And right now, by any yardstick, the FCC's maps are not accurate. So let's take just a little time to make sure they're better before we distribute $16 billion, which is the bulk of the funds that the agency has to distribute over the next 10 years for broadband. Because if we don't get it right, we're going to skip some communities, which might be in your districts, and they won't see assistance for broadband, and they will fall further and further on the wrong side of the digital divide. We need to fix our maps first. We need to have maps before money and data before deployment.
I saw you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. I saw that you published an op-ed in the Washington Post discussing how Section 706 of the Communications Act seemingly provides the President the authority to take control of, quote, any facility or station for wire communication, end of quote, if there exists a state or threat of war. With regard to wireless communications, you state that service can be suspended by a state of public peril or disaster or other emergency. You also point out that there's no requirement in the law for the President to provide any advance notice to Congress. This seems to be exceedingly broad and unilateral power, and with the importance of the internet in our current way of life, do you believe that it would be reasonable for Congress to create some boundaries, some controls, and some safeguards in this area?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I do. It's an obscure section of the law. It was last updated following that attacks on Pearl Harbor. But I think we have to take a fresh look at it because it unilaterally gives the President the right to shut down wired and wireless networks without judicial review and without any notice or review by Congress. I think if you want to rely on legal precedent and norms to constrain the use of that authority, I don't think these days suggest that that's the best course. I think it's a good time for Congress to take another look.
Okay. The United States is the only industrialized country with rising rates of maternal mortality. This crisis is hitting Georgia, particularly middle and southwest Georgia that I represent, and it's hitting us pretty hard. My understanding is that the FCC is working on a $100 million connected care pilot to leverage telemedicine to improve outcomes for expecting mothers and their children. And I applaud the FCC on this effort, and I applaud you for your leadership on the issue. Can you tell me a little more about the program and its potential nationwide?
Yes, thank you for the question. We have a crisis with maternal mortality in this country. Like you said, we're the only industrialized country with a rising rate of maternal mortality. It hits African American women and rural women especially hard. In fact, in more than half of our counties in this country, we no longer have maternity wards. And if we're going to fix this problem, telemedicine is going to be part of the solution. I've spent time with the University of Arkansas Medical School at the Mayo Clinic looking at what they can do for telehealth to improve the health care of pregnant women. This, to me, looks like one of the problems we might be able to solve with technology, so I'd like to see the FCC's Connected Care program focus on fixing it.
Thank you. I believe my time has expired.
Let me break the rules and interject. Best guess, how long would it take to fix the maps?
I
If we were to
think,
do it right now?
I think we could have really significant improvements within 3 to 6 months.
That is flatly incorrect. I consulted the career staff of the FCC. Currently, it already takes 6 months to analyze any particular Form 477 to make sure that they are error-free and that the maps can be translated into a verifiable version. That's before the recent legislation that was passed that doesn't give us the resources.
And I appreciate what you're saying. I'm just asking, what's your best guess?
It's certainly not 3 to 6 months. It's much longer than that. I can't give you a specific time frame because the recently passed legislation imposes new mandates that the FCC does not have the funding to be able to fulfill.
Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. I'm going to date myself when talking about these issues. It's difficult for all of us. I want to turn on my computer and I want to be able to immediately get online. It's very difficult in some of the area that I represent. But I want to talk to you about unlicensed spectrum, which powers technologies like Wi-Fi, and how that is critical to the U.S. economy. Currently, with the coronavirus, we are asking many companies, employers, even our own employees, to try to work out of their home. They need to stay connected to customers, to their peers that they're working with. So the 6G band would enable multiple new wide bandwidth Wi-Fi channels that are critical to a thriving economy. Next generation Wi-Fi requires far more bandwidth that is available today. When will the Commission move forward to enable shared Wi-Fi access to the band?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and for your leadership on this particular issue. The FCC and I personally have been sitting down with all the stakeholders, unlicensed innovators, electric utilities, broadcasters, and others, to figure out the way forward. And to me, the question is not one of politics or press releases, it's one of physics. We want to understand how much unlicensed spectrum can be accommodated in that band while protecting incumbents from harmful interference. But I've been crystal clear from the beginning that this could be a game changer for American consumers. If you're in a densely populated urban area or in a rural area, that smartphone could be the difference between you getting access to information and not.
And
so
being able to bring goods to market, which is even more critical than being able to turn on my TV and being able to download movies and music and all of that.
so we look forward to moving forward as quickly as we can, but we want to make sure the engineering is right.
But also, as a 911 dispatcher, I'm concerned about ensuring what you just said, that we are not taking away critical services and the need. We're looking at the need of 911 centers, of other public utilities that are critical to 911 service, such as coordination with rail movement, control of natural gas and oil pipelines. Previously, Public Safety Telecommunications Group expressed concerns with the research conducted on this issue. Has there been additional research done or commitments from the FCC to ensure incumbent users of this band that provide critical public safety services will not be disturbed?
Very much so, Congresswoman. That's part of the Office of Engineering and Technology's charge at the FCC. As I asked them to think about the variety of use cases, indoor and outdoor. Think about the power levels for unlicensed operations, low power or very low power. Think about all of the different incumbents that might be in that area, public safety, electric utilities, and others, and figure out what works.
Uber. If I'm on Uber and I don't feel safe, I can, connect with a 911 dispatcher and tell them my location, and they have to be able to track. So it's not just being able to dial 911 and have somebody answer, but to be able to utilize and incorporate all of these apps that are part of the system, whether it's Spectrum or anyone else.
That's absolutely right, and especially with a 6 gigahertz band, if we see unlicensed proliferate using that band, you could imagine a lot of information like that being conveyed automatically to public safety dispatchers. And I've seen some hints of the promise in the call centers I've visited.
Right.
We want to make sure that people get, the dispatchers who do heroic work every day, get that information without having to hope for it.
And thank you. I want to encourage you to, work with your transportation partners, because as we look to build new highways, that, we should be incorporating broadband. We can partner with public utilities, with private partners, to ensure that we're not just digging for a new road, that we are maximizing taxpayers' dollars. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you for being here. Rural broadband is an issue I've been working on for the whole time I've been in Congress. Arizona has large rural areas. In my district now, Cochise County is largely rural, but we've also got tribal communities. And in northern Arizona, it's not that unusual to have big snowstorms in the winter. And those communities are completely isolated. So I want to talk a little bit about telemedicine, because in some cases it's a matter of life or death. And so in many areas we have physician assistants and nurse practitioners who under Arizona law have to work under the supervision of a physician. So they could do that if there was connection, because the doctors are at the regional hospitals. But sometimes they're 200, 300, 400 miles away. And if they can't reach them, they can't really meet that requirement of supervision. So it's been a big problem for us. And a few years ago, the companies we were working with who were going to provide broadband wanted to trench cable, which was very, very time consuming. They said we didn't have the wireless towers to handle wireless communication. Is that still a problem that we're running into in rural Arizona and rural America? We don't have the infrastructure?
Congresswoman, I appreciate your question firsthand, having visited Navajo Nation a couple of years ago, and just a couple of weeks ago being on the Wind River Reservation. The Northern Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone share it in rural Wyoming, and they say the same thing, that in a sparsely populated part of the country where there often is not a business case, or where the topology makes it difficult to trench a cable, it's even harder for folks to get connected. But I'm proud to report that we've made tribal broadband a priority. In particular, for the first time in FCC history, we opened a tribal priority window for 2.5 gigahertz spectrum to allow tribes to serve those rural areas. And I mentioned Wind River. Thanks to an FCC program in 2018, I got to visit people who, for the first time, were getting gigabit fiber service. That fiber service also connects to the tribal health clinic there that allows them to do telemedicine. And I think we take it for granted in these big cities. If you have a sickness, just drive to the doctor. But if you're on a rural reservation and you have to drive hours, that's really not healthcare at all. And so we want to make sure we do everything we can to get these rural tribal members connected with what I call digital opportunity. It's a game changer.
Well, let me ask you, is some of this money that we're appropriating going to be used to increase towers, build towers in these areas so that we can have that seamless communication?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Not just the funding that's allocated, but also our regulatory reforms to make it easier to site those towers so that you don't have to jump through a lot of different regulatory hoops. You have a consistent level of regulation. You don't have to figure out, okay, what's going to be the rule in this state or that locality, and which federal department might have title to the land in the Mountain West, which, as you know, is an issue. So I've done extensive outreach to tribes, to state governments. I've met also with the various Interior Department and other folks to make sure that we provide a consistent set of rules that allow all of these companies to build a stronger business case for building broadband, wireless and wireline.
I'm glad to hear that. Hope that we can see that to completion. Commissioner Rosenworcel, I liked your statement, the future belongs to the connected. I think that's so true. And I grew up on tribal land in Arizona, even though I'm not Native American, and we were not connected. There were 2 televisions in town, and that was it. And we had the old crank telephones that you see up on the wall where you have to wind them up to call out, and but as a kid, who cares? I mean, it was great. I spent my time hunting, fishing, and horseback riding. But from an education standpoint, it really leaves these children at a disadvantage. And so I hope that we can, I think there's a role for the FCC's Native Nation Task Force to help improve the maps on Native American land, and especially when it comes to distributing education. So I hope we're making progress there.
Yes. All right, absolutely. Listen, when it came to the telephone, tribal lands were the last to be connected. And when it's coming to broadband, it appears that Native Americans are going to be the last Americans to be connected. That's not fair, and it's not right. These are some of the hardest places to deploy, and they deserve our agency's attention, and that's especially true for tribal schools, because those students need digital skills. They're graduating into a digital economy, and for them to have a fair shot, they're going to need broadband in their schools, and they're going to need some form of access at home at night.
It's so true. One of my cousins teaches at an elementary school and on tribal land, and she went out and got donations for laptops so that her students could have at least know the keyboard, if nothing else, because they don't have them at home. They just don't have them. They're not connected. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to continue along my colleague's question, although I did want to note that one of the stories that I will always remember from serving in Congress was last year's hearing, where the chairman disclosed that in his youth, as the youngest person in his family, it was his job to go to the rabbit ears that were on the top of the Quigley family TV and hold them just right so they could watch channel whatever with a minimum of whatever. It's like warmed the cockles of my black little heart. Great story, but anyhow, speaking of rural stuff, are you folks coordinating with the Department of Agriculture in your rural outreach efforts in terms of for administering the Digital Opportunity Fund? Because I know there's some resources there, so I would hope that we're kind of working not in silos but together to maximize that footprint.
Very much so, Congressman. I've personally met and discussed several times with Secretary Perdue the importance of being coordinated, so we're not duplicating effort. Our teams have also collaborated, and also when I go on the road, the Wind River Reservation visit I did, we made sure we had a representative from the Department of Agriculture there so that the tribal leadership that we met with, the Tribal Council, along with the federal government, could make sure that we were all on the same page, doing the most we can in a fiscally responsible way.
Okay, and I know that the amount of money there is not anything that anybody can say mission accomplished, but how are we prioritizing, for instance, I mean, we've heard about Native American, how are we prioritizing where that money goes each year? Is there a process, or how does that work?
That's a great question. So through the Connect America Fund Phase 2, which allocated, I would point out, funding to supply 8,202 locations in your district alone, what we wanted to do was estimate the cost to serve certain very difficult to serve areas. That was a certain cost, let's say, up here. Through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, what we've recognized is that there are other areas that are still unserved. We know they're unserved, but the cost might be somewhat less. And so what we're trying to do is figure out what those eligible areas are. We estimate approximately 6 million of them are out there. And then have a reverse auction where we encourage providers to compete for that funding, so it's not just cutting a check to a telecom provider. Then we have robust build-out requirements. And our hope is that we'll be able to target in a fiscally responsible way, just as we did the Connect America Fund, where those areas are, what technology is best suited to serve them, and make sure that the broadband providers do with that funding what they say they're going to do. We're not going to be paying these companies twice to do something they should have done right the first time.
Okay, so, and I know this is this does not lend itself to being, but what are we looking for when we get to a point where we can say to the folks in Arizona or any other district, it's like, hey, guess what? Your Native American locations are served, or in my district, because I have some too, but also, you know, it's like, hey, we've got some stuff that, I don't know what the right phrase is these days. Frontier, used to be rural, now it's frontier, which is worse than rural. So anyhow, what are we looking at for, how are we progressing? Are you saying, hey, I guess I need a feel for the money we have dedicated.
Right.
Is this a 10-year project? Is it a 20-year project? Is it a who knows project?
So the Connect America Fund has a 6-year term of support. They have to build out to all parts of that area within 6 years. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is a 10-year program, recognizing that fiber in particular takes a while to build. But I want to flag for the folks who might be watching, especially who represent tribal interests. There is currently a tribal priority window that I mentioned for 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that opened on February 3rd, closes on August 3rd. I strongly encourage rural tribes to take advantage of this opportunity. Instead of having to bid at an auction against big wireless companies, you can get the spectrum for free to serve your area. And we hope that they will take advantage of the opportunity because it's absolutely critical for them to be able to serve in parts of the country where fiber may be just impossible to deploy. And I also want to mention that I should have mentioned with respect to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, there's a special tribal broadband factor that I insisted and that my colleagues graciously agreed to include, which gives those who want to serve tribal lands a bump, because we recognize that it's more expensive, more difficult to serve those tribal lands. And so with that 10-year of support, with the 6-year building commitment that the RDOF has, we hope that we'll be able to solve that problem sooner rather than later.
Last one real quick, rural electric co-ops.
Yeah.
Not usually in metropolitan areas, are getting into the telecom business with the towers. So I assume that they're part of the mix in terms of making sure that we get everybody hooked up. And your impression, is that part of your mix when you're looking at this sort of stuff? Is there a rural electric co-op that wants to play?
Absolutely. This is one of the proudest achievements of the FCC under my leadership, I believe, is that we've encouraged companies like that to participate in our rural broadband programs. I just visited not too long ago East Central Electric Cooperative in Ada, Oklahoma, small town, even smaller co-op. Because of, I believe it's $22 million in FCC funding through the Connect America Fund program, they're going to be supplying gigabit fiber using their existing infrastructure, poles and whatnot, to thousands of people, including members of Creek Nation who've never known it before. To me, the job they did in the 30s and 40s wiring the country for electricity was a heroic effort. We need that same sense of purpose, that same sense of inclusion when it comes to rural broadband.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner, I have this sense that you had some thoughts about these matters.
All right, I do. Thank you for asking. Listen, we have a really big broadband challenge in this country. Frankly, we don't know how big it is. The FCC's official statistics say that there are 21 million people without broadband, but there are other studies that suggest that number could be as high as 162 million. Again, our data is poor, our maps are inaccurate. We don't know the full scope of the challenge. We got another challenge too, which is coordination. And by the way, this predates this administration, but for many years, the Rural Utilities Service at the Department of Agriculture has been giving out money and grants for rural broadband without coordinating adequately with the FCC. In fact, many of those loans and grants go out, and then the FCC winds up returning the money through the Universal Service Fund. We simultaneously have about 30 states that have their own broadband programs, and that's a good thing because we want states to get into the business of doing this. They know a lot more about what's going on in their own backyard than we do sitting here in Washington. But in the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund, we told those states we're not going to work with them. And I understand concerns about double spending and overbuilding, but here's the truth. If you start lining up our state activities, our FCC activities, and our Department of Agriculture activities, and we all row together, we're going to go further faster, and we haven't done that.
Mr. Christ?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Pai, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Appreciate you being here today. I would like to take a moment to thank Senator Thune and Chairman Pallone for their leadership on the Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence, or TRACED Act, which included my legislation to establish an interagency spam calls task force. Commissioner Rosenworcel, clearly Congress has taken the scourge of spam calls seriously, as evidenced by the bipartisan passage of the TRACED Act, with its sweeping provisions to address this problem. Can you please speak to how the passage of this bill will affect what effect the FCC is doing on it?
Sure. Well, thank you to everyone in Congress for passing the TRACED Act. I think we can all agree that robocalls are out of hand. They're insane. And we need to figure out how we're going to fix this problem because it's destroying trust in our communications networks and leading to a whole bunch of fraud. Now, you've given us new authorities, you've expanded our enforcement capacity, you've extended deadlines, but here are some concerns I have. When it comes to robocall enforcement, which is the #1 complaint from consumers at the FCC, we have 12 staff assigned to robocall enforcement full-time, and the average robocall enforcement takes 649 days. Like I said before, that's emptying the ocean with a teaspoon. We need more resources, and this committee recommended that the FCC set up a task force, a new bureau, a new unit to really strike at this problem. We haven't done so. I still think we need to do so. I think that advice from this committee was good, and we need to follow through on it.
Thank you. And how is the establishment of the Spam Calls Task Force that works with agencies like the FTC, Department of Justice, DHS, FBI going?
I don't have an up-to-date sense on that, but here's what I think is most important. We got to work harder with the Department of Justice. The FCC has issued more than $200 million in robocall fines to bad actors, but we've only collected about $7,000 according to the Wall Street Journal. And that's not the fault of someone sitting at this table. We got to figure out how we coordinate better with the Department of Justice so that they can help us go claim those funds, because we need both deterrence and retribution in this process.
Absolutely. Chairman Pai, I know that the FCC has a lot on its plate between the roll out of the 5G, addressing rural broadband, and the spectrum auction. Do you feel that you have enough resources to successfully fight spam calls?
Congressman, with respect to the implementation of the TRACE Act, we do. That we were already pursuing, for example, the imposition of regulations requiring carriers to adopt a new stir, shake, and framework for caller ID and do some of the other regulatory work. The estimate is that the amount of resources required for the additional obligations imposed under the TRACE Act are relatively small, I mean, low six figures. And so we do feel we have the resources to be able to do that. There's some other legislative mandates aside from robocalls that might be a different story. But with respect to that legislation, I can't say that we can discharge the mission, and I too want to thank you for your leadership on this issue. It's a scourge of civilization, as former Senator Fritz Hollings once called it, and I think every American with a phone would agree.
Thank you. So you think the resources are sufficient?
With respect to robocalls, I do. With the, for example,
I think 12 staffers is enough?
well, with respect to enforcement, we do have that division that's dedicated to robocalls, but there are many, many other staff within the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs
How
Bureau.
many total
elsewhere.
staffers are dedicated to stopping this
I
problem?
don't have the exact number of FTEs because some of them spend time on
Approximate?
other things. I would say it's definitely in the, could be close to 100 all said and done. I work with a lot of those teams all the time across the various bureaus and offices.
Well, if it takes, what is it, 649 days to address one complaint, and billions of these calls are going out, continuously,
Part of the
sounds
issue.
like we ought to get a little more in front of it, don't you think?
So in fairness to
Bless
the career staff at the Enforcement Bureau who do terrific work, part of the problem here is that some of these robocalls are very difficult to trace. It's not as if somebody is sitting there at a phone placing calls next door to the FCC and you can just walk across the street. They have to track them down. They have to work with the consumer to figure out what the nature of the harm was, et cetera. And so those things do take time to investigate. And they do a terrific job and have done a terrific job with the implementation of the authorities Congress has given us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Location data. Tools you have working good, you need new tools. I know I saw in the briefing here, it's like over 200 million again, proposed fines for 4 carriers. Like, well, okay. Is everybody gonna find Jesus as a result of that, or do we need to take them to church more? So it's a tools question, not a religious question.
Well, they better, whether it is finding Jesus or finding the law. We have determined that these 4 carriers in particular, as we've published in the notices of apparent liability, have a statutory duty to protect consumers' private information. And that's one of the reasons why the FCC investigated those allegations. And if you look at the notices of apparent liability, did a very careful analysis. What is the law here? What is the facts? Apply the facts to the law and determine what penalty we believe those carriers should pay. Obviously, they have a chance to respond, and we will take the appropriate action. But we wanted to send a strong message that consumer privacy is exceptionally important, and this FCC stands on the side of consumers.
Commissioner?
Sure. It was about 2 years ago that press reports first came out that our wireless carriers were willing to sell our location information. So for a few $100 million. Yeah.
I mean, I got one. I got 1 page of apps, so don't think I know what I'm doing with it. What do they do with my location? Like when I log into Maps and say, where's the nearest whatever? I mean, location information is...
There's a distinction here that's important between your apps and between the information your wireless carriers have.
Okay.
Your apps...
So what do they do with my location information?
So
They
I'm
sold
not going
it...
to talk about your apps. It's not within our jurisdiction. I'll talk about what the wireless carriers have. That phone right now is pinging whatever towers it can find around here. You want it to do that because that's how it works. But what you don't want, because you didn't sign up for it, and as the chairman acknowledged, it violates the law, you don't want them selling off your precise location within a few hundred meters for just $100. We found out that bail bondsmen were able to buy this and a whole bunch of other shady folks. And the problem is, try to imagine what that information looks like on a black market for victims of domestic violence, crimes, for espionage, for stalkers. That's bad stuff. Now, I think the shame here is it took the FCC 2 years to do this. That's a day late and a dollar short. All of our privacy and security was violated. But I think the decisions that were made were right on the law because this violated the Communications Act.
So for today, I haven't heard like, hey, we need another hammer or something like that. You're doing what you got with the tools you got, and you think you're sending a message that hopefully will be effective with the proposed fines.
I do believe that's the case, yes.
Okay, final thing, and so I can't even pronounce Corona right because I drink a different kind of beer, but Hawaii and ZTE.
Huawei, yes.
Okay, well, that's most of the letters of the state of Hawaii, that's all I know. So where's that at? I mean, I can understand where it's like, I mean, because there's accusations for U.S. companies basically building stuff in, and so it's like, so, I mean, we're not trying to be xenophobic or anything, but it's like, hey, if it's a security thing, so where are we at on that?
Great question, Congressman. The one bedrock principle is that the FCC will not compromise or stand the compromising of our communications networks. And that's part of the reason why last year we prohibited the use of our Universal Service Fund monies from being spent by telecom carriers on problematic equipment and services from companies like Huawei and ZTE. We also have instituted an information collection. We want every telecom carrier to tell us, if you're using this equipment or services in your network, tell us where it is. In addition to that, we've been working with other parts of the administration, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and other entities within the White House to make sure we're all on the same page domestically. That's just domestically. I personally have been involved on the international stage, visiting many, many countries, from Bahrain to most recently India, talking to some of our foreign counterparts about the importance of them having the same views on the supply chain. It's one thing for the United States to make a decision, but to the extent that these problematic carriers have equipment throughout networks around the world, they gain scale and ultimately can compromise our networks and compromise our ability to work with other countries with whom we might want to have an intelligence relationship. And so it's not strictly within our bailiwick. There's no reason necessarily for the FCC to do it, but it's very important for me, I think, to be able to show in word and deed that we, the United States government, take this very, very seriously. And I'm happy to give you a report on where some of those conversations stand with Malaysia and Bahrain and Brazil and India. But the bottom line is that we're all on the same page when it comes to
So
security.
it's a work in progress and is going to be, and continue to be.
It is. The one thing I would flag, however, is that the recent mandate, the mandate to rip and replace this equipment does require funding. And we are not, as I read the law, we are not allowed to use Universal Service Fund money in order to finance these telecom carriers domestically to rip and replace that. So we would require.
Let me just add on that. I think that they passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act last week, so we now have House and Senate legislation on this subject that will help us with that rip and replace, which is important.
Help
So
you
thank you
fund
for
that
it.
for those
Yes.
individual.
It will give us the authority to be able to do so. That's really important, especially for the carriers that serve rural America, which are more likely to have this equipment in their network. So thank you for that.
And I do need to talk to whoever your ledge rep is before you guys leave today about something else, but thank you guys very much, I appreciate it.
Commissioner, I just want to make sure, is there anything else we can be doing as it relates to Huawei, ZTE,
Yeah.
and so forth?
You know what? I don't want to just be fighting the last battle and the last war. I want us to think about the future. And one of the problems is we've been going around the world and telling everyone not to put this equipment in their networks. And we've gotten some reception, but there's only a handful of countries that have chosen, like us, to exclude it from their networks. So what are we going to do now? Because every one of our networks connects globally. What we need to do now is support the development of a more competitive and diverse network equipment market. Now, that's not easy because we keep on consolidating the wireless market in this country. At the start of the millennium, we had 14 wireless carriers. It was 7 wireless carriers at the start of the 4G era, and now thanks to the FCC, we're going to have 3. The problem is you don't get new providers getting into a marketplace when they can only sell their goods to 3 providers. So we're going to have to flip the script and move from focusing on hardware to software, which is a uniquely strong capability of American technology. And if we can move to open radio access networks, we're going to be able to diversify the market for this equipment, which is going to help us domestically and abroad. And I know the FCC is going to hold a forum on this, or maybe we'll see what happens in the next few weeks. But I hope we can also set up test beds for this technology to accelerate its development and deployment.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add briefly, as the Commissioner mentioned, we are holding that virtual radio access network forum on March 26th. But in addition to that, there's some other issues that I think it would be important to bring to your attention that I don't want to discuss in an open forum, but I do want you to know that we would be more than happy to meet with you in either our SCIF or yours to share some of the information, some of the ideas that we've got.
I appreciate that. As you can tell, we're going through a second round very quickly, but Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much. Chairman Pye, as noted in the FCC's website, the Plain Writing Act of 2010 was signed into law by the President in October 2010, requiring all federal agencies to use clear government communication that the public can understand and use. It further states that in keeping with the letter and the spirit of the law, the FCC is committed to writing new documents in plain language using the federal plain language guidelines. Meanwhile, you published a notice entitled, quote, WCB seeks comment on discrete issues arising from Mozilla decision, end of quote. This doesn't seem to be very plain language to me, and based on the title, I have no idea what issues the FCC is requesting comment on. Is the FCC, as Ms. Rosenworcel alluded to in her opening statement, trying to hide the ball from the American public? If not, why is that language so vague?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. And I suppose one can always take a shot from the peanut gallery along those lines. But when you have the responsibility of running an agency and responding to a remand from a court of appeals like the one we had on particular discrete legal issues, I rely not on our political judgment, but on the judgment of our career staff in the Office of General Counsel and the Wireline Competition Bureau. And because they drafted it in a way to respond to the particular issues, that is exactly what we approved. And I'm not going to sit here and second guess the career staff's decision to tee up for the public those different things. And if you want to see complicated language, look at the 338-page order that my colleague in the previous FCC adopted on this topic.
Mr. Chairman, you're a pretty intelligent man, and
please tell my wife that.
I don't think you would have to consult with your staff or your counsel to figure that out. What do you think, Ms. Rosenworcel?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're accountable to the American public. And when polled, 86% of the American public supported net neutrality. And they wrote us in droves. They jammed our email inboxes. They flooded our phone lines to tell us they didn't like what the agency did. And when we rolled back net neutrality, we made it possible for our broadband providers to block websites, to throttle services, to censor online content. And now a court is asking us to revisit some of that. And we have put that request for public comment in legalese. I think that is hiding the ball, and I think we're hiding from the American public on net neutrality. We shouldn't be doing that. We should do better.
Thank you. I've mentioned this before, and I'll do so again. Enforcing reasonable fees for intrastate prison calls are essential for the rehabilitation of inmates by allowing them to feel connected to their families and their communities. As you know, this is an important issue for me. It simply makes sense from a justice and a rehabilitation point of view. What specifically does the FCC need from Congress in order to make this happen?
Congressman, I appreciate the question. I know we've had exchanges about this before. The previous FCC made a mess of these issues. Over my dissent, they imposed regulations that I warned and that were, in fact, struck down by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And in particular, the D.C. Circuit said that the FCC, as an agency that has jurisdiction over interstate issues, cannot regulate intrastate rates. We would need authority saying that the FCC does have authority over intrastate communications, such as the type you're referring to.
Yeah, we are not approaching this issue with the urgency we need. It's been a decade and a half that the FCC knows that usurious rates are charged for prisoners and their families just to stay in touch. That matters for all of us because it helps with rehabilitation to maintain contact with loved ones. And the FCC's been trying to lower those rates because right now most prisoners and their families pay as much for a single call as you and I pay for a monthly plan. The FCC needs to act with urgency to fix ancillary fees, site commissions, interstate rates, and then we need your help, as the chairman suggested, on intrastate rates. And I'm certain that both of our offices would be happy to help you to do so.
Thank you, Chairman Quigley. I apologize for being late. We're bouncing around between different hearings, so much to the Secretary of Interior's chagrin, I just relieved Mark Amadei so he can go rain on that parade. I understand my distinguished colleague, Mr. Christ, had brought up something regarding robocalls before, but I was wondering, when can Americans expect to see real reduction in the amount of robocalls that they get? Because that is something, boy, passing the bill was one thing, but you hear everywhere you go.
Great question, Congressman, and a question that frustrates me too, because I get these robocalls just as much as your constituents do. We believe that the imposition of the new shake and stir framework which the FCC is poised to vote on March 31st will be a substantial improvement by attaching essentially a digital certificate, a digital fingerprint to every single phone call. Consumers and carriers will know if that phone call is going to be legitimate or not. And some consumers are already seeing an identification of likely spam. In addition to that, we've been providing companies with tools, enabling them to block robocalls by default based on analytics, setting up a reassigned numbers database so consumers don't get phone calls that are meant for somebody else, and taking other tools. We understand that for many, many years, this has been the top category of consumer complaints to the Commission, and we're determined to pull out the stops in order to address that complaint.
All right.
You're smiling as though I teed you up. So.
I know. Listen, at the start of the administration, we had 2 billion robocalls a month. Now we routinely have 6 billion. This is getting worse, not better. And Congress is working hard to give us new authorities. The agency is working hard. But here are 3 things we need to do. We need to make sure every company is required to offer free tools to every consumer to help control these calls. They shouldn't have to pay for this mess. They shouldn't have to pay to fix it. They didn't create the mess. Second, it takes the FCC on average 649 days for an enforcement action for robocalls. I don't have time for that. We need more resources. We need more people. We got to do better than 649 days.
The campaigns are over by then.
And then finally, look, someone is accepting these junk calls on the networks. We got to figure out who it is, who's turning a blind eye to it, and help with, by working with the industry on what's called the traceback process to identify where those bad actors are loading this traffic on networks. And then we've got to shame them, name them, fine them, and they didn't even consider taking away their Section 214 licenses.
I can't tell you how many times I was going to be arrested because of some IRS thing that I owed and that I didn't take this call. The second part of this, though, is my understanding that unwanted political robocalls that are received on cell phones are a separate violation each and every call?
I think that's because we have different rules under the Telephone Consumer Protection Act for wired and wireless technologies. It's an old law. It was developed at a time when you paid not just for outgoing wireless calls, but for every incoming wireless call. As a result, there are restrictions on auto dialers, which would be all robocalls on wireless phones, but then there are only restrictions on telemarketing on wired phones, which creates, I think, a political speech exception that might warrant your attention because it seems a little retrograde at this point to have different standards for wired and wireless phones.
You know, if I may, Chairman, thank you. I know the President and the FCC are committed to the development of these 5G networks. Can you explain why the U.S. should make an effort to be at the forefront of 5G development, especially as other countries like China have made it a priority? And 2, how is the FCC undertaking the important work of expanding our nation's 5G networks while at the same time considering the needs of currently underserved areas like rural Ohio that may not have access to 5G connectivity for many years?
Great questions, Congressman. With respect to the first, it's important for 2 reasons. Number one, because it's a major driver of job creation and economic growth in this country, along with encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation. The other countries around the world saw what America did with 4G LTE, creating the networks of the future at the time, and the mobile app economy that went along with that. Hundreds of billions of dollars in additional value created for American consumers and job creators. They want to seize that initiative for themselves, and so that's part of the reason why we want to make sure we lead when it comes to 5G. And the FCC's 5G Fast Plan, which you can find at fcc.gov/5G, talks about how we're pushing out spectrum in the commercial marketplace, how we're modernizing our regulations to promote the infrastructure of the future, how we're updating our rules to make it easier to deploy fiber. Those are what are going to deliver American leadership in 5G. The second component of it, however, is also working across the administration to make sure that we promote 5G deployment. And that's part of the reason why when the President and I held the event last year on 5G, the President said, and I agree, that we want America to be the best place to innovate and to invest when it comes to 5G technologies. With respect to the second question, which I suppose my answer bleeds into, we've been doing a lot in terms of spectrum alone. 2 successful spectrum auctions, a millimeter wave spectrum in the last couple of years. We're in the middle of a spectrum auction right now, which is about to finish up. That's generated over $7 billion in bids, holding 2 more spectrum auctions this year, the 3.5 band on June 25th, the C band on December 8th, and many more bands in the pipeline. Considering where we started in January 2017, when we had no mid-band spectrum on the shelf at all, we've made substantial progress. And I do hope that in a bipartisan way, we can advance this technology to make sure that all of those folks who are thinking about where to invest capital, where to hire teams, they'll set up shop here in the United States to make sure that the innovation happens in a free market, freedom-loving country like ours.
Well, I gotta admit, I was astounded to find out in parts of the district that there was no connectivity, and that if we're gonna do things like telemedicine, telehealth, teleeducation, that's an important part of the process. So I urge you to whatever you can do to help that program. God bless.
Definitely, and along those lines, that's one of the reasons why the 5G fund that I proposed recently is so important. We recognize that no matter how much we modernize our rules, no matter how many spectrum auctions we have, there are going to be parts of the country where you're never going to be able to create a business case for building a 5G network if you're a private company. We think it's the FCC's job to step into that breach, to make that business case, to help make it. And so with that additional infusion of funding, our belief is that we can target parts of the country, rural tribal areas, even maybe densely populated urban areas where providers might not find a case, and allow them to participate in this part of the digital economy. It's really important for us to work together to make sure that no American is left behind when it comes to 5G.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time here today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Chairman, I have to ask you, you referenced the president, and I did notice in your life in the minority that you talked about independence from the president, correct?
Right.
That's true. Have you had attempts by the administration, the president himself, or anyone there to ask you to do certain things, tell you to do certain things, attempt to influence in any way, shape, or form the decisions you have to make?
No, sir.
No effort in that vein?
Pardon me?
No effort in that vein by them?
No, not only that, I committed in 2017, at least on the Senate side, and I believe on the House side as well, to inform you if that was the case. That is not the case.
Anything else, Ms. Joyce?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate your work and your cooperation today and being here, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. We are adjourned.